Hello and welcome to week 2. This week we're moving from the Harlem Renaissance into modernism, realism, and naturalism. But before we get into that, I want to discuss two housekeeping things that I want you to make a note of in your syllabus. The first thing is that I am creating a new deadline, or I should say, I'm changing the deadline for the discussion board posts. And the new deadline is going to be set for the following Monday at noon. And all of this will be detailed in the course management site when you go on the discussion board post. So when you go on this week's discussion board post, which is going to be discussion board post number 2, your discussion board post will be due no later than 12 noon on May 25th, which is a Monday. Along with discussion board post 2 for this week, you're also going to need to go back to discussion board post number 1 and respond to one of your peers' discussion board posts. So, discussion board post number 1 will also, or I should say, I will reopen discussion board post number 1 for this week. And a couple of you have sent me emails letting me know that you weren't able to post in time for this week. So get your post up for discussion board post number 1 as soon as possible. And this will be the only time I'll be willing to make an exception. As we move forward, once the discussion board post is locked, it is locked. And then from that point on, I won't be able to read your post and you'll receive a 0 for that assignment. And if you have any questions or concerns, just please let me know. Or if you find yourself running into an issue with posting, I'd much rather you let me know prior to the deadline rather than afterwards. So let's move on to what we are going to discuss this week. So, like we said last week, a lot of the authors that we were reading, such as Zora Neale Hurston, such as George Samuel Schuyler, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, they were concerned with the characteristics of African American expression. And even though Du Bois criticized some of the Harlem Renaissance writers at the time for being too decadent and being too into art for art's sake, we're going to see that Du Bois's attention to this idea of the social consciousness and upbuilding society, or I should say art as a mode to build society, is going to find itself in the modernist, realist, and naturalist period. So we're going to read work from Richard Wright this week, who was a very significant figure during this movement because he signaled this sort of change from the Harlem Renaissance and the Harlem Renaissance writers writing for this quote-unquote idea of art for art's sake and celebrating, characteristics of African American expression, identifying those characteristics of African American expression, arguing if those characteristics are African or particularly here designed and originated in America. And we're going to see this shift from that to what is the responsibility of the African American writer. So we're going to read the blueprint written by the Blueprint for Negro Writing, written by Richard Wright, that basically criticizes the Harlem Renaissance writers and then this move towards we have to write, or African Americans have to write for the social context in which they're writing. They need to write for their audience to uplift their audience. So there's going to be much more of this social context, this social function for the literature. Now, along with that, you're going to also be looking at 3 major terms this period, and those terms will be modernism, realism, and naturalism. So the first thing in terms of modernism, which is an extremely vague and tricky term. So in one sense, in a very, very large sense, modernism is something that influences all genres, all disciplines. Modernism influences literature, it influences architecture, it influences film, it influences all different forms of cultural expression. Modernism is a period that it's a very large period that historians describe as beginning as early as European exploration in the 16th century and ending as late as the 1960s. So, like I said, from that wide, expansive period of time, we have colonization, European colonialism, and then we have how modernism sort of influences different areas of cultural expression. Like I said before, architecture, film, literature, either in clothing, art. But we also see modernism in these sort of more limited contexts, such as literature. So when we think of modernism in the American literary context, we're thinking of a time during the Harlem Renaissance writers. We're thinking about the 1900s up until around the 1950s, all right? But when we think about it in the African American context, it has even more limitations, or I should say it's even more distinct. So when we think about this idea of modernism in the African American literary context, we want to start thinking about this shift from, again, this idea of this idea of writing literature for art's sake and focusing more on the realistic qualities of literature, paying attention to the environmental conditions, paying attention to the social constructs. So think of modernism in terms of African American literature as the umbrella to realism and naturalism. So realism, in that sense, would be a representation of a material reality. So writers like Richard Wright, writers like Gwendolyn Brooks, who you'll read, writers like Dorothy West, they were more concerned with capturing the real aspects of African American life. And the things that you're going to read about this social context is that we're not only, during this time, we're not only influenced by, World War I and World War II, but we're also influenced by a second migration that takes place shortly after World War II. In the Harlem Renaissance, you read about the first Great Migration that was taking place from the late 1800s all the way up to the 1920s. So in this context, you're going to read about the second Great Migration that took place primarily from the South to a lot of the larger cities such as Chicago and New York and Detroit. And so you're going to read a lot of the settings within these stories from the modernist period in African American literature take place within these larger cities and within the urban landscape. So if realism is a representation of a material reality, then naturalism is a representation of a harsher, franker treatment of sort of like the power structures of that reality. So while Richard Wright was definitely a realist writer, the story that you're going to read, The Man Who Lived Underground, is much more on the naturalistic side because the main character is a product of his environment. And as you read through the story, I want you to think about the representation of the underground for the narrator. I'm sorry, not the narrator, but the main character, Fred Daniels, and how his life changes as a result of him ascending to the above ground world. So when we think of naturalism, it's also this realistic storytelling, but it focuses on the harsher treatment of the environment on the character. So those are the things I want you to think about as you're moving forward and reading the reading selections for this week. Like I said before, you'll be reading about realism, naturalism, and modernism. I've also uploaded a quick PowerPoint presentation that I've used in my face-to-face classes that sort of gives you a short, quick, straightforward explanation. Also, you want to be aware that in Richard Wright's The Man Who Lived Underground, because it's a longer story, I have sectioned it off into 3 sections. So if you go in the content section, you'll notice that The Man Who Lived Underground is in 3 segments. Then you'll be moving on and reading Dorothy West's Living is Easy from chapter 1, the Cleo chapter. And along with Dorothy West, you'll also be reading another significant figure at this time, Ralph Ellison. And so Ralph Ellison has been compared to Richard Wright on many occasions in regards to writing. And you're going to read about that in this whole analysis on realism, naturalism, and modernism, sort of how Ralph Ellison and Richard Wright sort of shared similarities in their writing, but Ralph Ellison's there was sort of this departure with Ralph Ellison in the sense that his characters were educated. His characters had a sense of their identity, and then we'll see when you read Invisible Man, the nameless narrator has a sense of his invisibility. So the characters that Ralph Ellison writes tend to be much more conscious and aware of the harsher sort of power structures of their oppression. And finally, you'll read one of my favorite poets, Gwendolyn Brooks. And you'll read a few poems from her. And then I've also, on the announcements page, I have uploaded a short clip from Gwendolyn Brooks that talks about her inspiration for writing one of her famous poems that you'll read entitled, We Real Cool. Along with the fiction that you're going to be reading, I want to come back to, and I'm pulling this up right now to make sure. So along with the fiction that you're reading, remember I talked about this idea of methodology. And last week, you all read about formalism and new criticism. And some of the major characteristics, like we talked about last week with formalism and criticism, is this idea that you can find the meaning of a story, of a poem, of a film, of any sort of text by looking at the text itself. As a formalist or new critic, we don't care what the author says, we don't care about the time period, we don't care about the social context. Now, when we moved, the new method that I'm going to introduce this week is known as sociological criticism, which goes in complete opposite to that. But it's extremely fitting for the fact that we're reading Richard Wright, who says that African American authors have to pay close attention to the social context in which they're writing. So this week, I want you to make a departure from formalism and new criticism. And when you read the fiction this week, and you're going to actually have to do this on question number 8, just like you did with the poetry from last week. This week, I want you to look at the poetry from a sociological approach, and I'll have a link that will lead you to sociological criticism. Again, if you have any questions on that, please let me know. Until then, along with that, if you have any questions about anything else, let me know. If you have any questions about the deadlines with the discussion board post, as a reminder, I'm changing the deadline. The discussion board post will now be due every Monday at noon. And if you have not uploaded your discussion board post number 1, make sure that you do that as soon as possible. As always, I'm here if you have any questions or concerns. Happy reading, happy writing, and I will see you in cyberspace.